All right, welcome everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to get started. A couple of notes. We are recording today's webinar, so we will have everyone muted until the end. If you do have questions, there's a questions panel in the GoToWebinar controls, and you can type in questions as well as ask them at the end. We are doing audio through GoToWebinar, but there's a phone bridge with an access code if you need it, as displayed in the screen. You should also have that in the invitation you received. So without further ado, what is Azure and why should you care? My name is Neil Rosenberg. I'm the President and CEO of Quality Technology Solutions, QTS. And this is a topic that's a bit near and dear to my heart because I find that there is a lot of confusion and lack of understanding in the market around what Azure is and what the capabilities of the technology are. And this is a very, very strategic technology to Microsoft, and I would argue to all of you as well. So thank you for taking the time to join us in this event and learn. About QTS, who we are, we have been in business for 23 years. We're a Microsoft Gold partner and a locally managed partner with competencies across most of the Microsoft platform, but we're a Gold partner for both data center and data platform, which is, or cloud platform, which is Azure, and Cloud OS Partner of the Year for 2014, which is also Azure. We have a very strong practice around cloud and on-premise technologies, and very consultative in the way we work with customers. Our engineers are senior talent. There are employees, very good communication and interpersonal skills, so very good working collaboratively with our customers. So why the cloud? Why all the interest in the cloud? There are a number of key drivers that are making organizations, even that were not as interested in the cloud a few years ago, focus on the cloud today. And I would say the majority of the clients we work with have at least some cloud footprint and plans for cloud adoption. And a lot of organizations are broadly adopting the cloud across multiple workloads. The reasons are, number one, speed. It allows businesses to be able to utilize technology much faster because a lot of the infrastructure is pre-built out, as you'll see in an upcoming slide. It also gives you the ability to scale rather than have to pre-build capacity and only use a portion of it. You can use what you need when you need it, and in many cases simply pay for what you use. And then lastly, the economics of the cloud are significant. Data center providers and cloud scale providers like Microsoft and Amazon, Google, others simply have a different economy of scale than the typical large corporation, and the typical large corporation has a different economy of scale than a mid-size organization or a small business. So the bigger you are, the more scale you have, the lower your costs are going to be to operate, support, and maintain infrastructure. And in the cloud, Microsoft and other vendors are passing that savings along to you. So it's very economically compelling. It creates flexibility for scale, and you can roll out solutions much, much faster than you could with on-premise technologies. I would say the cloud is a given. Most of the CIOs that I work with have at least some level of cloud footprint, and they see a lot of value from being able to utilize the cloud and more rapidly deploy technologies. So it can be transformative in terms of being able to drive new initiatives faster than you would if you had to build out your own infrastructure platform. Doesn't mean the cloud is right for everything, but it means that when the cloud is appropriate for a use case, things can often be done at lower cost and much faster than they could in on-premise scenarios. So let's talk a little bit about what the cloud is and what the cloud represents. In a traditional world of building IT infrastructure on-premise, you would need to, in order to deploy a new application or workload, take a deep breath here, you would need to configure the networking, configure the server hardware, configure the operating system, configure the virtualization, configure the storage, configure the security management, load balancing and integration, configure the databases, configure the runtimes where applicable, and configure the applications. And yet, what is the reason we're doing all this? For the applications, for the business value that the applications drive for an organization. In a cloud model, and we'll look at software as a service first, you are really able to just immediately go to configure and customize the applications. The networking, the server hardware, the operating system, all the stuff down below that is already pre-defined, pre-configured, and scalable to the benefit of an organization. Now, software as a service, examples of that would be Office 365, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, etc. Potentially Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics CRM Online, Box, Dropbox, OneDrive, Workday, Concur, wide variety of applications that are turned on and ready to go in the cloud. You can get up and running just by supplying a credit card. Infrastructure as a service is another type of workload, and essentially this represents virtual machines in the cloud. You have more work to do configuring infrastructure as a service than you would software as a service, but certainly less work to do than you would configuring traditional on-premise IT. So half the underlying platform is already built and scaled for you in an infrastructure as a service scenario. And then lastly, platform as a service is a scenario similar to software as a service, but you're providing and managing the application itself. The underlying support infrastructure is there for you, but you're writing your own code and often providing management of that application in the cloud. The difference between infrastructure service and platform as a service is that with platform as a service, you're just developing the app. Infrastructure as a service, you have to break the app out across virtual machines and services and so on. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So these are the different cloud scenarios, and of course every month there's new as a services, and we're going to talk about a number of different ones that Azure also provides, including disaster recovery as a service, storage as a service, identity, desktop, etc. But the two core workloads where Azure really started are platform as a service, and then shortly afterwards, infrastructure as a service. And so when you look at Microsoft's cloud strategy, Microsoft started with Office 365 back in the days when it was the Business Productivity Online Suite, or BPOS, as its initial software as a service application, although their forefront applications actually predated Office 365. You also have Dynamics CRM Online, and now some of the Dynamics ERP products are coming to the SaaS world, and Power BI, which is a part of Office 365 or freestanding, and then the Enterprise Mobility Suite. Those workloads are essentially SaaS-type workloads, and then within Azure, we support really 4 different constituencies. The developer and app platform constituency, and that's with Visual Studio, where you can build and compile applications to run in Azure, and the Azure App Service to be able to run an application platform as a service. You have 2 new areas that we'll touch on toward the end of today's presentation, the Cortana Analytics Suite and the Azure IoT Suite. And then lastly, infrastructure as a service, which is kind of a fusion of Azure and Azure Stack, which is essentially Hyper-V managed by System Center, and the Operations Management Suite as well as System Center. So these are kind of how the building blocks of Microsoft's technology relate to their cloud strategy. So that was a rather roundabout way of getting to, so what is Azure? In a lot of ways, I would say Azure is really the next strategic opportunity for IT. I mean, when you're an IT leader, a CIO, an IT director, a business leader who has IT responsibilities or business responsibilities that are supported by IT, the question becomes not how do I build better infrastructure, but how do you use IT to drive innovation within the business? And that's really what it's about, is creating business value. Azure, as a cloud service that reduces the time to deploy technology and reduces the cost of deploying technology, creates the opportunity for innovation. And with that, potentially the business benefits of productivity, growth of your client base, the ability to do real-time insights and analytics against the data in your systems, and to just do new and creative things. I think this is a very exciting time to be in IT because of the opportunity for creativity that we have. So Microsoft's strategy around the cloud is essentially building off of their legacy as an on-premise provider with servers and clients and application software. And in that world, you had physical servers and you had virtualization with Hyper-V, and obviously some of you are running VMware and perhaps other products for virtualization. But when you look at Microsoft's cloud strategy, you have the access to public cloud platforms, and that's Azure. So whenever you hear anyone from Microsoft say public cloud, that's going to be Azure. And private cloud is going to be your on-premise or data center infrastructure. It might be at your office, it might be a third-party data center. And then software as a service would be things like Office 365, Dynamics CRM Online, etc. And so Microsoft's strategy is to provide those cloud services, but do it in a way where you can hybridize the cloud with on-premise, which gives you flexibility to put what you want where you want to, based on performance, based on cost, based on seasonality or usage patterns. There are a variety of things that will drive those decisions, but the key here is that Microsoft has both on-premise and cloud solutions that can be hybridized and integrated. And so from an Azure perspective, you have, again, your traditional data center and your cloud platform, and you have a variety of services provided by Azure. And essentially, you have the ability to run the same type of infrastructure on-premise. And Microsoft calls that now Azure Stack, the ability to essentially use Hyper-V and Windows Server and System Center to manage a private cloud that can be integrated with and hybridized with the Azure public cloud, so that you can write code for on-premise and just recompile it and put it up in Azure. You can build virtual machines on-premise or in Azure, or if you have sufficient bandwidth and management capabilities, you can move or migrate virtual machines from on-premise into the cloud. And bandwidth is an important consideration, and obviously security and networking, which we'll spend some time on, is a very important consideration. And so the idea here is that we'll use Azure to extend the private cloud into the public cloud and also integrate with software as a service applications through identity as a service with Azure Active Directory, or Azure Active Directory Premium more specifically, and we'll come to that in a bit. When you look at the different vendors in the marketplace, Microsoft is the one who essentially covers the gamut of different solution areas and has been recognized in Gartner's Magic Quadrant as either a leader or the leader across all the major different cloud services. So Microsoft in that regard is a very safe bet, and with QTS we've bet our business on Microsoft, but we're very comfortable with that because of the position Microsoft has in the marketplace, and frankly also the level of innovation they're driving today. And speaking of momentum and innovation around Azure, I won't go through all these stats, but there's a tremendous momentum around Azure, and it ranges from small organizations that are being nimble and aggressive to use technology quickly, to large organizations that are achieving massive economies of scale. So this will only continue to grow as more awareness arises outside around what Azure is and what people can do with it. And again, I talked about scalability before. Microsoft has a massive economy of scale with Azure. They have a large number of data centers worldwide. Recently, in the last year and a half, we've had additional data centers open in Asia Pacific and South America to increase the footprint that was already strong. A massive amount of cable and fiber connectivity linking the data centers worldwide, a massive content delivery network to maximize performance. The Azure infrastructure is actually larger than Google and Amazon combined in terms of the scale and capacity that Microsoft is providing. And the fact that it's regionalized gives organizations the ability to place workloads closer to users and where it makes the most sense, as well as the ability to replicate data across geographies. So let's talk about some of the building blocks of Azure. Number one, we already kind of talked about hyperscale, the ability to scale massively. And number two, an enterprise proven platform, which is shown by the adoption rates in the slides I indicated before, but also the ability to be hybridized, which is a major differentiating factor. So we can run on-premise, we can run in the cloud, or we can run as a combination. We also have, and this is a big change for Microsoft, but we have an open and flexible architecture. It's not my way or the highway with Visual Studio. We have support for Linux as an operating system with multiple different flavors. There was recently an announcement of Red Hat support in Azure, very strategic for Red Hat and for Microsoft in that regard. You have support for Docker containers within Azure, as well as multiple vendors' databases and app frameworks, as well as different management platforms and applications. So the ability to run a wide variety of non-Microsoft technologies in Azure is in some ways surprisingly refreshing, but gives that much more scale and applicability to the platform. If you see under applications, you'll notice the second icon there is WordPress, which is ironically a Google technology. Our website, QTS's website, runs in Azure as a WordPress application. So again, you have support for multiple vendors and non-Microsoft technologies. That gives developers a lot of flexibility to use it as platform as a service. Building beyond that, we have, and we were just talking about developers, the ability for developers to use a variety of toolkits and programming languages. So it started with Visual Studio, but you have a lot more beyond that developers can take advantage of to write their code, potentially test it on site or test it with Azure, and then compile it to just run platform as a service in the cloud rather than tying it to individual virtual machines and having to scale it manually. You have the ability to scale massively and on demand when you write applications for Azure, including mobile applications. And this is a whole new area of creativity that Azure enables. Next up, we have the ability to integrate and extend SaaS applications, so whether it's Microsoft apps like Office 365 or Dynamics, or third-party apps like Salesforce or Box, or even Oracle Financials or Concur or Workday. We'll talk in a little bit about Azure AD Premium, but Microsoft with that technology currently has support for, I believe, over 2,500 cloud applications that can be managed from an identity perspective in Azure, tying back to your on-premise Active Directory, which gives you a lot of control to support this cloud-first, mobile-first world. And then lastly, trust. Microsoft supports across their products most of the major regulatory frameworks, both in the United States and worldwide. And there's additional detail we can provide here if any of these frameworks are applicable to you. But essentially, all the major standards from a regulatory perspective, a governmental perspective, are supported in Azure. And so the next slide is a bit of an eye chart, and I apologize for that, but it really gives you a sense of the breadth and scope of services that are provided in Azure. And it's a big slide, so it's taking a moment to build here. But I refer to Azure, just as we let the slide build out, I refer to Azure as a Swiss Army knife of capabilities, that there are just so many different functions and capabilities within Azure, both from an infrastructure perspective across compute, which is your virtual machines, storage, which we're going to talk about, and networking, and then all the platform services from a developer perspective that can be taken advantage of. So I like to think of this as a Swiss Army knife that you can just pull out the blades that you need for a particular task, and it doesn't mean that you need to know everything about every blade. That's part of the value that Microsoft partners like QTS provide, is to help guide you to the pieces that you need, help you develop the strategy, and help you to then build the expertise you need to use the platform. And this slide just basically shows the massive rate of change in Azure, that there are new services introduced on sometimes even a daily basis, services both in terms of software capabilities, in terms of support for third parties. It's just growing at an exponential pace. It's further evidence that the days of Microsoft releasing a product and waiting 4 to 5 years for the next major release and 1 to 2 or 3 years for a 0.5 or R2 type of release are long gone. The internet has changed that, and Microsoft is much more responsive these days in terms of keeping up with the pace of change. So much so that it's a bit bewildering in terms of the amount of information that we all need to keep track of. There is a roadmap site that goes over what is recently released in development in the near term, et cetera, for all of Microsoft's cloud platforms. And I should have put a link on this slide, but I will share that on follow-up with anyone who's interested. And we're actually going to be starting a quarterly webinar series going over new features and capabilities across the cloud platforms, just to help keep our customers up to date on that. So stay tuned with our webinars if you're interested in that. So let's start breaking this down into more pieces. Let's talk about the networking components of Azure, because at the end of the day, you have your cloud, you have your on-premise, and how do you connect them? Because if you don't connect them, how do you use the technologies that are in the cloud? So starting off, you have the ability to define a virtual network within Azure. It's essentially your IP subnet or group of subnets and your addresses that you're configuring within Azure. It'll use your DNS if you so choose. And essentially it isolates your network logically from anything else that's in Azure. It's your security boundary. You have the ability to take that and tie it to your on-premise environment through a site-to-site VPN. And this is the most common way organizations at least start with their connectivity. So essentially the Azure Virtual Network becomes an extension of your on-premise network. Think of it almost like a branch office or a data center, and you're connecting over the internet. Or you could say, I might want to connect via private connection. Hold that thought, we're going to get back to that. So you would be able to essentially run virtual machines in the cloud or applications in the cloud as an extension of your own network through doing a site-to-site VPN. We can then connect clients into both networks through either through Azure, either from outside your network or from in your network, and that can include the ability to tunnel and traverse firewalls and proxies. So all this needs to be configured, and this is part of what QTS can help you do through our Quick Start services or through a project to get you up and running with Azure, or help you plan out using planning services vouchers if you're an enterprise agreement customer. And then we can extend our infrastructure to improve performance and capability, and that is through something called ExpressRoute. And ExpressRoute is a technology from Microsoft that allows for you in certain cases, to connect your network to Azure on a private connection, not over the public internet with encryption, an IPsec VPN like we talked about before, but a private connection either into your MPLS cloud through a carrier like AT&T or Verizon, or through a data center provider. Equinix and a number of others have express route support, so that instead of traversing the internet and having potentially performance considerations, reliability considerations, quality of service, etc., you can do a private connection to Azure for situations where you want more bandwidth, more reliability, and potentially as well more security. And recently, Microsoft introduced ExpressRoute for Office 365 and Skype for Business for larger customers who wanted to be able to get that direct connection, piggybacking off of the ExpressRoute infrastructure that was built for Azure, for customers that want that high performance and private connection into Microsoft's other cloud services. There's a whole network of ExpressRoute partners. Some of them are telcos and some of them are data center providers, and the list is growing. There's a Microsoft webpage in their, I believe it's TechNet site, that lists the providers and that is updated as it changes. There are also some providers that essentially general contract and tie into these folks' networks. So talk to your telecom providers or talk to us about your environment. We'll help you figure out if ExpressRoute is available to you as an option. And then also there's a lot of content delivery network endpoints to speed up performance. And so if you think about your on-premise private cloud and use of Azure with whatever applications you happen to be running there as a public cloud extension of your private cloud, the Microsoft vision is to allow you to integrate those and manage them through System Center. And those of you that have System Center today know what a powerful platform that can be for managing an on-premise environment, whether it's Microsoft or mixed with third party. But the ability to manage Azure and Azure workloads from within System Center, especially System Center Operations Manager and Orchestrator, gives you a greater degree of control and scale to take advantage of. And then lastly, you have the ability to integrate that and build off of System Center or independently use something called the Operations Management Suite because we didn't have enough product names from Microsoft and we needed more product names and suites to keep track of. So OMS, because of course it has to be acronymized, OMS is a collection of technologies from Microsoft that can be added to an enterprise agreement or can be consumed separately, that essentially allows you to utilize the cloud to get greater operational control and availability of your network. The main thing that's driving OMS today is Azure Site Recovery, and we're going to talk about that in the Disaster Recovery as a Service portion of today's presentation. But you also have the ability to utilize Operational Insights, which is a cloud dashboard technology that can pull data from System Center Operations Manager, or you can put agents onto individual computers to roll data up to OMS Operational Insights. Operational Insights is not Ops Manager in the cloud. It is a small subset of Ops Manager. But it does give you the ability to visualize data, and you can use it as a visualization engine for your operations manager data. So this is all tools that we can help you to understand how to integrate and tie together. So we talked a little bit about platform as a service and the ability to run applications in the cloud without tying them to specific virtual machines. Infrastructure as a service. So the idea here is you can build websites or applications. You can put them wherever in the world you want them located based on your usage patterns and potentially redundancy. One of the nice things about Azure is you have the ability to control where you replicate data and how many copies of data gets replicated. And so depending on your desired application footprint, there's a lot that can be done to scale it and ensure local availability. We also have the ability to build mobile applications. So it's not just about building web apps or Windows apps, but you can use Azure as a platform for distributing or running applications and providing data to applications on various form factors and device types. And so think of it as a massively scalable web server in the cloud is essentially platform as a service. That's a totally unfair generalization, but it helps you get the point. And by the way, I mentioned the economy of scale of Azure. You know, we're used to thinking of scaling networks in terms of servers, and perhaps they're rack mount servers that go into a rack. Racks go into data centers. Well, the smallest unit of expansion in Azure is about the size of a tractor trailer. And it's got racks and racks of servers built in with all the cooling and power pre-configured, and they just essentially snap these things together as the smallest building blocks. So it really is amazing the scale that Microsoft is able to achieve, and that you can then take advantage of as you need it from a scalability perspective. So that ties to infrastructure as a service, and infrastructure service as a service was introduced a few years ago. Obviously, it's a direct competitor to Amazon's offerings for virtual machines in the cloud, and those are the two major players, although there are others. And the idea is to be able to take virtual machines that you might run on-premise today and run them in the cloud instead, but without having to pre-buy the SAN and the networking and all the virtualization platform underneath. Microsoft's platform is based on Hyper-V. It's not exactly Hyper-V, but it's compatible technology and uses the compatible VHD and VHDX file format. So you essentially would have the ability to take a Hyper-V virtual machine and run it either in your own data center or run it in Azure. And you can move VMs, or you can generate VMs off of templates that Microsoft provides, or you can run it in a third-party data center. And there are third parties that have tied into Azure and essentially give you maybe more flexibility than Microsoft might, but not at the same price point. So you'd have to look at and decide what makes the most sense for you based on your applications and your goals. One of the common challenges I find working with organizations in the mid-market is dev test. Companies that have maybe hundreds to thousands of computer users have mission-critical applications that in an ideal world they would have the duplicative or triplicative hardware and resources to be able to run an exact copy of production as a development environment for code changes, and also as a test environment for testing changes to configuration settings and new upgrades and updates to applications. Also, you need a test environment to test the impact of operating system patches on third-party applications before you roll them into production. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't do that as well as they should or as well as they would want to, because it's very expensive, and it's also very time-consuming to set up and maintain and keep it in sync with production. So a lot of organizations are not able to address that challenge of running a good test dev environment on-premise. But in the cloud, it becomes a lot easier. You're not pre-buying a massive amount of infrastructure. You're not setting everything up from scratch. A lot of the platform is already available to you. Virtual machines can be copied or cloned, and the environment can be maintained, but you also only pay for what you use. So if a VM is only running one day a month or a couple hours a month, your utilization and consumption is going to be much lower than a traditional test dev environment on-premise. So this is a very low-hanging fruit sort of workload for infrastructure as a service. That being said, there are a lot of other potential workloads. So the little green quadrant upper left we just talked about, which is test and development. There are organizations that run SharePoint in Azure infrastructure as a service. Why would you run SharePoint in Azure? When you have Office 365 and the ability to run SharePoint as a software as a service application. Well, software as a service, I'm limited in what I can do. I'm using a pre-built service. I can't write my own code and customize it in whatever way I want to. I can't plug in any and all third-party code into it because it's a shared tenancy. But if I make virtual machines in Azure and I install SharePoint on it, I can do whatever I want to those virtual machines. Because if anything goes wrong, I'm the only one who's affected by what I do to my virtual machines. So that's a viable use case, is to run SharePoint in a hybridized environment, but instead of the on-premise being on-premise, it's in Azure. SQL is also a use case, especially for BI and data warehouse type applications where maybe you're going to have spikes in usage of compute resources, but not necessarily consistent production level usage. And you would think SQL wouldn't be an Azure use case because of performance, and Azure is primarily lower cost, high capacity SATA type disk, although there is the ability to get higher performance storage now. But SQL is very dependent on spindles, on the number of actual disk drives when the data is striped across a lot of drives in an array. So Azure has a massive amount of spindles, and therefore you can get, certainly for workloads like BI and data warehousing, decent performance. There are some organizations we work with that are moving all of their infrastructure to Azure, and I know some Amazon as well. But most organizations tend to move application by application. There's often a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, so to speak, that you can identify for putting particular workloads up into the cloud. We're going to talk about storage as a service in a separate slide, so I don't want to steal that thunder here, but there's a couple of areas for that. And then lastly, things like Active Directory federation services. If you do a site-to-site VPN and connect Azure to your environment as a separate network, you can put a domain controller up there. You can put ADFS up there. And essentially, for Office 365 and other applications, make access to those applications tied to your Active Directory, but independent of your physical infrastructure if you're running a copy in Azure. When we do Office 365 and we do ADFS, we always do multiple domain controllers and ADFS servers, and putting a pair of them in Azure is a great use case. In fact, that's what we do at QTS. So there's a lot of different workloads that are suitable for Azure in terms of infrastructure as a service, and we can certainly explore them for your individual situation as is appropriate. Let's shift to a related area. We talked about infrastructure as a service. Now let's talk about disaster recovery as a service. Because a lot of organizations are challenged, and I even find in the mid-market, there's a lot of organizations that don't have solid disaster recovery infrastructure because it's very expensive and it's very time-consuming to build and to maintain. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations just don't have the resources to create a clone of a production environment and maintain that at a second site and be ready to fail over in the event of a disaster. And that's part of why organizations often move to data centers, is at least the reliability and shared infrastructure is better than a lot of organizations have at their own headquarters. But it's only a partial solution, because if the data center goes out of service or loses connectivity, then an organization will be down, and that can be massively disruptive. It can even cripple a business and take companies out of business. So the ability to do disaster recovery at a fraction of the cost, and also in less time and effort than it would be taking traditional approaches, is very appealing. So Microsoft had technology in Hyper-V since 2012 that essentially does replication. Just like a domain controller replicates data to other domain controllers, we can do Hyper-V replication between Hyper-V virtual machines. That's the Hyper-V replica technology built into Windows Server. Or we can do SAN-to-SAN replication if you have, say, a NetApp platform with SnapMirror or EMC or other vendors that have similar SAN-to-SAN technologies. You can replicate at a storage level, or you can replicate VMs to Azure. And Microsoft purchased a company last year that made replication technology not only for Microsoft, but also for physical servers and VMware environments. So we can essentially replicate virtual machines, Microsoft or VMware, or physical servers that are not virtualized up into the cloud and use Azure as the DR site. So in the event of loss of connectivity, in the event of loss of entire site, you have the ability to run your business in the cloud. There's a lot of networking considerations. You have to understand the performance dynamic. You have to understand the applications, and perhaps applications may not be supported virtual or may not be supported on Hyper-V. But in the event of a disaster, running, even if unsupported by the vendor, is better than not running at all. So the disaster recovery is an area that requires a lot of planning and a lot of careful thought. It's an area we help customers with. And you have a whole new range of very cost-effective and fairly fast to implement scenarios based on Azure as disaster recovery as a service platform. And with technology that's built into Azure for orchestration, based on the technology from Microsoft System Center Orchestrator, the old Opalus technology, we have the ability to create scripting for automation as well, so that we can do automated failover, and you wouldn't necessarily want to do automated failback, but a controlled failback from Azure. Now, next is storage as a service. And if we have these massive economies of scale in the cloud, let's take advantage of that from the standpoint of one of the most expensive areas of running a data center, which is disk. Disk, whether it is for primary storage or for backup, can be very expensive. And one thing I've learned over running QTS for 23 years plus, and over being in this industry for over 30 years, is that the amount of data just continues to expand exponentially. And so that's going to drive up costs, including management costs and backup costs for organizations. How do we get a handle on that? How do we control that? And part of it is planning, but part of it is also efficiency in the storage. So the ability to drive down costs around storage is one of the significant factors that I would say is driving look at the cloud right now. So one of the areas that you can do storage as a service is essentially what Microsoft would call bottomless cloud storage. And I think it's kind of funny sometimes how concepts just recycle in this industry. I look at this and I see hierarchical storage management. We used to work with that technology back in the palindrome days in the 1990s with Novell NetWare. But the idea here is that we have our data on premise. We put it onto a StorSimple storage array, and there are also some third-party technologies that can do this. This is primarily for static sort of tier 2, tier 3 data workloads. You can run some tier 1 workloads on a StorSimple, but it's not really optimized for that. Even with the 8000 series, there are some limitations, but the low-hanging fruit here is things like file services, archive data, the stuff that's written and accessed infrequently, but that you have to maintain. And so if you hook your file servers up to a StorSimple appliance, and depending on the volume of your purchase of Azure, this might even be something that you can get from Microsoft as part of the Azure purchase, all the data will be backed up into the Azure cloud by replication. And over time, as you start to run out of space on the appliance, the data that's not being accessed gets taken off the appliance and just resides in the cloud. And it can be geo-replicated and protected, so that Microsoft is essentially taking over your backup and your data protection for all that data, helping you to reduce your backup window for the stuff you're protecting on site. We helped a large New York law firm put significant terabytes of data into the cloud with Azure using this technology, and eliminate shelves and shelves of storage on their EMC, the expensive machine company, EMC SAN platform, Actually, they didn't eliminate it. They just were able to redeploy that storage to other things because storage continues to grow all the time. And so we have the ability to look at different storage workloads. Here's another backup. Windows Server 2012 has some backup technology in it, and System-Centered Data Protection Manager is cloud backup technology that works with Azure as a backend. It can be on-premise or cloud. We've done work with Commvault Sympano, which is a great backup technology that integrates with NetApp and other storage platforms, and has native support for Azure built in. So we've done for a number of customers disk to cloud rather than disk to tape backups, and used Azure as the back-end repository for that data. So this empowers a whole new set of scenarios that you can take advantage of. We haven't seen as much traction here, but I think this is going to grow over time. I think most of what I've seen here is in the small business space, where organizations just try to get rid of all their infrastructure and put it all in the cloud, but desktop as a service and or application delivery as a service. So let's break this down a little bit. In the traditional on-premise world, we're used to, and we've had for a long, long time, session-based computing. You might think of that as terminal services, which is now remote desktop services, or you might think of it as Citrix, Citrix presentation server, MetaFrame, XenApp, whatever you want to call it. The idea of running sessions within a Windows server that look largely like a Windows desktop, but it's not the same underlying operating system, so you could have application compatibility issues, but it's very cost efficient and manageable at scale. And a lot of organizations do this for remote access, for deploying particular applications. There are a lot of great use cases for session-based computing. VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, is running pure Windows virtual machines on a hypervisor. So you have greater application compatibility and perhaps greater performance, but also greater resource consumptions, because running Windows VMs on a hypervisor is much more resource taxing than running a couple of terminal servers on that hypervisor. You're not going to get as many users per physical host. And you have more complexity in a VDI environment. So you got to look at what's right for your organization. When you look at the cloud, there are a couple different scenarios. We can do RDS with infrastructure as a service. So that could be either of these two scenarios. It can be RDS protocol accessing session-based computing or accessing VDI. But what you also can do is Azure Remote App. And Remote App is a capability within Azure where you can essentially publish applications either off of templates Microsoft provides, like Office Pro Plus as part of Office 365 is a standard template in Azure, to be able to run those applications essentially as virtualized apps from Azure without additional configuration and customization. So the idea behind Remote App is that you can essentially, wherever you are, take your applications with you and use them with flexibility from a wide range of devices. That looks pretty appealing, actually. So from a Citrix perspective, we're also a Citrix partner, and we've done a lot of Citrix work for 20 plus years. You have the traditional on-premise scenario of deploying XenApp for session-based computing or presentation virtualization, and Zen Desktop for full virtual machines running on a hypervisor. And we can do that on-premise, or we can do it in the cloud using Azure infrastructure as a service, or potentially outsource to a third party. Some Citrix partners provide that as a hosted service. Citrix Workspace is Citrix's technology that they're rolling out now for essentially a subscription approach to be able to run Citrix infrastructure in Azure as well as other clouds. And so Citrix is deeply vested in support for Azure and empowering customer choice that way to give flexibility. And an example would be, traditional on-premise environment, but you can tie it in via ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN and be able to have a domain controller in the cloud, just like I described before, but then those purple blocks might be my web access technology. Those might be NetScaler virtual machines running in Azure. And then the plumbing that sits behind XenApp, the delivery controller, a license server, SQL database server, etc. And then however many XenApp servers or Zen desktop Windows virtual machines we may happen to be running. And this can scale. There's a lot of considerations around the scaling and the planning for it. Another workload is identity as a service, and we're kind of segueing into something called Azure Active Directory here. So I want to be clear, Azure Active Directory is not a massive domain controller in the cloud that you replicate your Active Directory to. You don't configure your AD sites and replicate your domain controllers to Azure Active Directory. It is shares the name Active Directory, but it is a different technology. Azure Active Directory is a database that sits behind applications, including Office 365, and maintains user IDs and passwords and rights. So it does the same thing as on-premise Active Directory, but it's a different technology that gets synchronized in a different way. And the way that that synchronization occurs between your on-premise Active Directory and Azure Active Directory is a utility that you run on a server or virtual machine that used to be called DIRSync, D-I-R sync, directory synchronization, that is now called AAD sync, Azure Active Directory synchronization. And the name change occurred when Microsoft added multi-forest support into the DIRSync tool to support customer environments that had multiple AD forests. And so AAD sync will synchronize your user IDs, your metadata, and if you choose to, your passwords up into the Azure database that sits behind Office 365 and other cloud applications. But you also have the ability to tie Active Directory Federation services, and goes beyond the scope of this discussion, as a way of having applications authenticate directly back against your on-premise Active Directory. So they're complementary technologies. What Microsoft has done in establishing identity as, let's say, the control plane for cloud applications is you have your on-premise Active Directory, and then Azure Active Directory, and then cloud applications, whether it's Office 365 or third-party applications. And Azure Active Directory represents your database that synchronizes with your on-premise and then can enable single sign-on for cloud applications based on the data that's either stored in Azure AD or passed back through, if you're using Active Directory Federation services, to your on-premise domain controllers. And so the idea here, Satya Nadella describes the world as a cloud-first, mobile-first world that Microsoft is supporting. And we want to support mobility and choice of applications, but as IT leaders, we want to do that securely. And we want to do that with the ability to manage the technologies. And so Azure Active Directory Premium is technology from Microsoft that empowers self-service and single sign-on to cloud applications. And it does so through a catalog of currently over 2,500, this slide is a little bit dated, over 2,500 cloud applications. So if you're using Salesforce, Concur, Workday, Box, Dropbox, a wide range of cloud applications, you can control access to those applications through Active Directory, provisioning in one place, but then equally important, deprovisioning and shutting off access in one place. There are a lot of other capabilities that are built into Azure Active Directory Premium, including the self-service capability, including multi-factor authentication. Microsoft bought a company called PhoneFactor several years ago, so that you essentially, it's like RSA tokens or multi-factor authentication tokens, but it uses your phone to display the access code for the multi-factor authentication. So you have basically the Azure AD Premium technology controls access to cloud applications tied back through your Active Directory. Taking it a step further, Azure Rights Management, which is part of Microsoft's Enterprise Mobility Suite bundle along with Azure Active Directory Premium, allows you to attach rights to your documents and your data so that when you send an email or a document to somebody who may not have access capabilities or rights to it, you can control that. If I send a document to somebody that's stored on a file share, they can open the document. But if I set security rights that say only specific people can open the document, print the document, copy contents from the document, and it gets forwarded to someone else, they're going to be prompted to authenticate. And if they don't authenticate successfully, they're not going to be able to get at that content. And then lastly, Windows Intune is the third of four major components in the Enterprise Mobility Suite. The fourth is Advanced Threat Analytics, which is a security reporting and analytic technology. Intune is essentially mobile device management. It's Microsoft's competitive offering to an AirWatch or a Mobile Iron or a Mass 360 to allow you to manage Apple devices and Google devices and Windows phones from the cloud or tied back into your system center infrastructure, and to do so based on policies and to be able to control which devices can access email, to be able to wipe and load, etc. So it's essentially a very robust management technology. It's not part of Azure, but because it's bundled with Azure AD Premium and Azure Rights Management Services in the Enterprise Mobility Suite, you have that integration from a pricing perspective. And this is a very hot area where we're working with a lot of customers to deploy these technologies, because at the end of the day, the Enterprise Mobility Suite is about empowering mobility in a secure and manageable way. Now, the newest pieces of Azure are going to be under the analytics platform. And as a quick time check, I'm not going to have a lot of time to go into depth here, but there's a lot of information available, and perhaps we'll do a follow-up drill down here. From an analytics perspective, most of you have probably heard of Cortana, which is the technology that started in Windows Phone and was introduced into Windows 10 for voice integration and voice command of Windows devices. The Cortana Analytics Suite is essentially a collection of Azure services for data analytics and machine learning that lets you look at data that you put into your Azure big data stores and analyze it and visualize it, including the ability to interact with it through voice. So customers that have data in their existing on-premise applications, as well as that want to look at maybe publicly hosted data sources from big data providers, are looking at the Analytics Suite as a way to accelerate the ability to make better business decisions based on that data, rather than building applications from scratch to do that, because business intelligence is a very expensive area traditionally. This is separate from Microsoft Power BI, which is an extension of Office 365 as well as a freestanding product, and QTS offers services around Power BI. We can get you up and running on that in a couple of days to go against a variety of data sources. That would tend to be individual data sources, whereas Cortana Analytics Suite is about big data primarily. We also have the Internet of Things, or IoT, and the nature of the game that we're playing here is changing. It's going to be, I believe, by 2017 that the number of devices that are IoT non-PC devices will eclipse the number of traditional computer and phone devices that we're used to today. One of my favorite IoT examples is a washing machine company, a laundromat company that essentially put sensors into all the washing machines, and these circuit boards run Windows, and it collects information about service histories, it collects information about the weight of the laundry in each machine, and it takes all that data that allows you to improve the machine's service life and predict failures and stuff like that. But it also takes all that data and rolls it up into the cloud and aggregates it within Azure for analysis. And so the idea of Internet of Things is that we're changing the nature of what we're looking at as a computing device and deeply broadening it, but using Windows 10 particularly, have the ability to manage those devices with management tools we're comfortable with and with group policy and other security mechanisms, because that broadens our attack surface from a security perspective if we don't do it right, and then using Azure as the data collection and analysis mechanism. And so from that perspective, Microsoft's Azure IoT suite allows you to essentially connect these devices and use Azure as the repository and the reporting mechanism to analyze the data you collect from this IoT world. So I covered a lot of material. We're coming up at, or we just are at the end of our time. We covered a lot of material today, but I want to take a couple minutes to recap some next steps and possible calls to action. Number one, and before I forget, we do have this deck available to everyone who's in this webinar. That should be in the handouts section of your control panel for GoToWebinar, or contact us if you'd like to get a copy. We're also going to post the recording of today's presentation. So as a follow-up, we'd love to meet with you by phone or in person to talk about your roadmap and strategy and help you figure out how Azure fits into your environment. This is a great use case if you have them for planning services vouchers as a software assurance benefit. If you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, we have our quick design offerings, which are often funded by customers out of planning services vouchers. And a 3-day Azure public cloud planning services engagement is a great way to build understanding and awareness of the various Azure capabilities, and also to brainstorm and map out different areas that Azure can apply to your organization. But we also offer planning services across many other workloads that we serve, including private cloud with System Center, Hyper-V, and Windows Server Active Directory, the Office 365 workloads of Exchange, Skype for Business, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Yammer, and Windows 10 Windows deployment. We also have quick start engagements, which are QTS packaged service engagements, typically a 1-day, 2-day, 3-day, or 3-day, 5-day, 7-day, good, better, best way of going about implementing these technologies, and we have them for Azure itself, as well as the various components of the Enterprise Mobility Suite, System Center, and a number of other products. So if you're interested in any of our quick start engagements for a pilot proof of concept, or getting these technologies spun up in your environment as a project, please let us know. And then also, we've been doing some other seminars and webinars. We just completed a 5-city roadshow on Windows 10, which we recorded that content, and we're expecting to run a webinar for that in early December, as well as one we did on extending SCCM. So with that, that wraps up today's webinar. We'll switch and see if anyone has any questions. And I don't see any questions in the question section. And we'll give it another minute or two. Going once, going twice. All right. The information on this slide shows where to reach us, info@qtsnet.com, or my name, Neil Rosenberg, and rosenberg@qtsnet.com. Please reach out if you have any questions or we can be of service. And I thank you very much for your time and attention today. Have a great day, everyone.